there, and welcome to our show, The Shit No One Tells You About Writing. I'm best-selling author Bianca Murray, and I'm joined by Cece Lira of Wendy Sherman Associates and Carly Waters of PS Literary. Hi everyone, today's guest is an internationally best-selling author whose novels have been translated into more than 30 languages. Her debut, The Flat Share, sold over 1 million copies and changed her life completely. All 5 of her subsequent novels, The Switch, The Road Trip, The No-Show, The Wake-Up Call, and Swept Away, have been instant Sunday Times bestsellers. She writes her books in the English countryside with a very badly behaved golden retriever for company. If she's not in her writing shed, you'll probably find her chasing a toddler with a strong coffee in hand. It's my pleasure to welcome back Beth O'Leary. Beth, welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
Yes, and thank you for joining us. I know it's late in the evening there, and I know that pre-pub everything is so busy, so I'm sure you've had a really busy day, and you're still joining us, so we appreciate it.
Wow.
So for our listeners who are not watching on YouTube, and you really should watch on YouTube because we have some really funny moments that you see on camera that you don't necessarily hear or will see on the podcast. What I'm holding up here is Beth's book, The Name Game. Lovely, lovely cover. It looks a bit battered. I'm starting to realize that I'm quite rough on books. After I finished reading them, they look really worse for wear.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, I say the same, but other authors freak out. So really lovely cover. Let me give you some of the flat copy and then we're going to dive in. So a man and a woman with the same name are looking for a fresh start, only to discover they've landed the same job in this charming new romance by best-selling author Beth O'Leary. Charlie couldn't be happier to take the job of farm shop manager on the remote wild Isle of Orma. She's grieving, a little lost, and in desperate need of a fresh start. Jones has come out of a difficult breakup and is looking forward to some peace away from the noise of his city life. Moving to Orma couldn't have come at a better time. But when Charlie Jones and Charlie Jones both turn up at Orma's one and only farm shop, claiming to have been offered the role of manager, everyone is baffled. How could this have happened? And just who is the real Charlie Jones? Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so this is going to be such a tough book to talk about,
I
Beth,
know.
because...
And you know what? This is one of my first interviews about it, and I'm so worried I'm going to say something I shouldn't because, yes, there's some surprises in there.
Yeah, I am worried as an interviewer because for me it's so important to protect the sanctity of, no reveals. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but for our listeners, I'm going to be careful with my phrasing and Beth's going to be careful with her phrasing. And just to show you how interesting a romance novel this is, on the jacket copy, we've got a blurb by Gillian McAllister, who writes psychological thrillers. And she said surprising and heart-stopping. So firstly, you're not expecting an author like Gillian McAllister to be blurbing a romance novel. So speak a bit about that for us, please, Beth.
Well, I mean, I am actually very lucky to know Jilly. So that is one of those things that I think if you're not in the publishing world is an interesting thing to know about blurbs, is that sometimes they happen because, I can hand it to her and say, please, could you read? And so I feel very lucky in that respect. But also there are surprises in this book. And I think the reason my publisher were interested in getting that quote was because it is a way of sort of saying, isn't it, there's a little bit more sort of surprise and mystery to this romance than you might otherwise expect.
Yeah, I mean, as an author as well, I have friends who write in different genres, and I'm not an author who can stick to one genre. So I will approach one author friend, please, to blurb, one book and another one to blurb another, because I wouldn't have them doing it. So this is a great way to signal that this is something a little bit different. So, okay, inspiration. And again, I don't want to give away the twists. What came to you first, or did this start off as something else and it evolved?
Yes. So it was much more, and actually this is always how I start, really, is with that hook, with that question, with an unusual situation that either brings people together or connects people, because I want to write about human relationships. And so it's kind of trying to find a kind of a wait, what sort of question. is where I start. So with my debut, The Flat Share, that was two people share a one bed flat but don't meet because one of them works nights. It's that kind of what if. And then what I work to do is really ground that sort of unusual concept in something that feels like, okay, well, what would actually really happen if you were in that situation? So I started with two people with the same name, a man and a woman with the same name, and that was the beginning. And I really did like us, when we embark on this story, I too had no idea why there were two Charlie Joneses turning up on the Isle of Orma. So that was unsurprisingly a big journey for me. But yeah, I always start with that kind of big concept, and then I ask myself, who are these people, and what might be a really interesting way to answer that question that I've sort of posed, I guess, of, in this case, why are they both there, as well as all the other things that are kind of happening in that story of, the two of them getting to know each other, determined not to fall in love.
Yeah, I mean it's incredible, and I love that you do it that way, because I think for a lot of writers, they write the book and then afterwards they're trying to find the hook, right? They're like,
Yes.
oh, I wanted to tell this story about this and that. And then when someone goes, yeah, but what's the hook? Then they really struggle. So I think it's really smart to start with that what if and that hook and then take it from there, because it makes it much easier.
Yeah, I'd actually never thought about it that way, but I suppose it is. It's like leading with the part that you're going to lead with when you explain the book to people.
Yeah. So something that I want to discuss is intentionality when it comes to structure, because a lot of emerging authors will go, oh, I'm going to write third person close because that's what I feel comfortable with, or I'm just going to write first person because that's what I feel comfortable with. This book, there is so much intentionality in terms of each thing that was chosen. And again, I'm going to be careful here because it's part epistolary novel. So we have sort of diary entries, we have emails as well. And then we have sort of multiple POV third person close when it comes to backstory, but the diaries and the emails are in the present day timeline. So again, was that something that it started off that way, or was it as you were coming to grips with this concept, you were going, okay, this is how I'm going to need to handle it?
Yes. So the decision I've always wanted to write diaries. I love reading them, and I like voiciness in my first person narrators anyway. I like to really lean on kind of making you feel like whenever you're in one of their chapters, you really know you are. And so diary is almost like an extension of that in some ways, isn't it? It's just having a little bit more voice on the page in some ways. And I've wanted to do it for a while. I wanted to do emails for a while. So that kind of definitely sparked my interest. And the other thing that it also allowed me to do some other things that were useful plot wise and interesting plot wise. And I thought very hard about the decision to use those, to have those kind of past stories. And it was one of those things where I really just had to try it, and I really didn't know how it would feel. Sometimes you can plan and you can figure it out, and I just thought that was one of those things that I needed to feel whether it felt disjointed. And for me, I hope it really works, but it was a lot of fun, and I definitely stretched myself in terms of that, and in terms of kind of using first and third. And these are things, it's funny, I said to my husband when I was kind of talking through all these decisions with him, he was like, I don't think I know what your other books are written in. And it's really odd, isn't it, because he's read those books many times. But I think when you're a reader who doesn't kind of have a writer's head, you're so caught up in the story, you're not necessarily thinking about it. But of course, those decisions are often very intentional. I'd say I'm most comfortable writing in first person. I only tried writing in third with my fourth book, and I remember how. So I get it if people are nervous about it, because I remember that it almost feels like trying on someone else's shoes. You're like, this is weird, like this is kind of like writing, but I'm doing it in a slightly different. It almost changes your voice, I think, when your writing voice. So I do get it, but yeah, I was having a field day playing around with it here.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but you'll read and you'll get to like the twist. And then when you come back and read again, it makes so much more sense. Things that you weren't really paying attention to. So that's why I speak about that intentionality, because there was so much intentionality here. So for listeners who are struggling with, should I do this? Should I do that? Definitely pick up this book to see how the structure really aids the story. something important, especially when it comes to first person narratives, especially in diary entries and in emails, is really differentiating the two characters' voices. And I know, I've watched some of your Instagrams and stuff, and you've said that when it comes to editing, you will look at different things in different edits. So for one thing, you might edit just for tension and pacing. Another time, you'll come and look at it just for characterization. So is that something you come to at one point to really make sure that those voices sound unique and different?
Yes, I will always do it multiple kind of voice/character edits. So I'm like trying not to get distracted by line kind of fiddling or all the other things that I want to fix, and just trying to make sure that their character sings out wherever it can. And one trick I always use, I mean, this isn't a very clever trick, but there are always certain words, phrases, even types of punctuation that each narrator, and this is not necessarily exclusive to when I'm writing like diary, like in this book, I'll do this if I'm just using a first person narrator, is they will have a few, maybe no more than 3 or 4, but just distinctively them turns of phrase, little things. And I hope that they almost pass you by, because they're very subtle. But I think they do something in terms of really just having a repeated, it might be just that one character says ugh, and if they're frustrated, and the other one says something like as small as that. But I think all those things, little things, are little signals to you that add up, that you're with this person, not with that person, because that is really important to me. I think it's a chance to give, like, there's a chance in every line to give more character if you're using voice in that way, and you want every opportunity to help your reader know your character as deeply as possible. So like, why miss a trick? Just pile in everything you can to do that.
Yeah, I mean, and there's quirks. So someone, one character might use contractions, or they may not use subject, verb, object. They may just, so again, for our listeners, a great way to see how to differentiate voice one from another and to consistently apply that. And it's, like you said earlier, that the reader won't really pay attention to point of view. They won't really pay attention to this and that, because if you're a good writer and you're doing your job, you draw them so much into the story that they're not even focusing on that. But again, to become such a good writer, you have to know your craft, and you make it look so easy, but it isn't easy. And that's why we sort of pick this apart on the podcast to go, okay, read this book. You immersed yourself in it and you got swept away by the story. But how did that author do that? What were the little things that they did?
Yeah, I think the dream is that you make it look effortless, right? But I am certainly not a writer who writes effortlessly. I delete tens, if not hundreds of thousands of words for every book that I write, partly because I am a writer who learns through writing. I think this frustrates me about myself, and I've had to sort of come to accept it, that I can't always go in knowing what I'm doing, and sometimes it's better not to try because I'm just wasting time. So sometimes I have to, it's that really hard decision, isn't it, of when am I ready to start? And most of my books have at least one quite major false start. So I will really think I've got it, and I'll be like, yeah, and I'll maybe write somewhere between 5 and 20,000 words before I'm like, I'm way off. Like, I'm in the wrong place. The wrong people are involved. Like, I'm talking about that wrong. And there are a million other wrongs along the way. So yeah, I think it's definitely a case of just honing and honing and honing, and knowing as well. And this is a lesson that I hold on to, that the work that you're doing, sometimes it can feel like it's going to show, like people are going to see that I struggled so much with this book, and it's not going to feel the same as the one that I wrote in 3 months in a beautiful creative burst, because some books are like that and some books aren't, at least for me. And I would say, like, it doesn't show. If anything, often I think those books that have been crafted and have beaten you, and you feel like, you can't do it, and then you do it again. And those books sometimes can be the most sort of accomplished because you've shined them, you've made them as perfect as you can. And some of, if I look at my backlist of titles, some of my very most beloved books that I most often hear from readers about are ones that I remember thinking, will people feel it in here? Like, will they be reading this and feeling the effort that I put into it?
Some books, it feels like you have to wrestle them to the ground, you know? It's like an octopus. It's like, oh my God, I've got to get all these hands and I've got to really struggle with this
And
concept to
why
tame
are
it.
some like that? And why, I really wish, and maybe with experience you develop this skill, but I wish I could tell when I come up with the idea whether it's going to be one of those, because I always think it's going to be a nice easy one. Every time I'm like, well, this book's going to be really straightforward, like I can't see any problems here, I'll figure it out.
I think it's just as well you don't, because then you may not actually dive into it,
Yes,
you
that's
know?
very
And
true. If I
yeah.
knew, then maybe I'd never do it.
And the false starts and deleting that work, I think it's so important because, yeah, I think a lot of emerging writers just write the first draft and are like, that's it, it's amazing, and I'm sending it off to an agent, and they don't see how many words do get deleted and how much feels like it's wasted, but it's never wasted, because you would never get to the point where it feels right if you hadn't gone through all the false starts and all the words that had to be deleted.
Yeah, one of my sort of major pieces of writing advice is always finish the first draft, because so much of the work of crafting the actual novel happens after you've done the first draft. And I mean that to be sort of like empowering rather than like, oh God, because it feels like I'm saying everything, all the work starts now. But what I mean is sort of just let yourself have a bad first draft, because you cannot have a novel until you've got an end to at least start reshaping. And for me, I often don't know what the book is until I read, on some level at least. And I'm often a little surprised by my first draft. I'll kind of, particularly, tonally or pace or something like that, I'll read it through and I'll be like, God, this is like a lot faster than I expected. Or this is, this is a more thoughtful novel than I thought it was going to be. Or it's things like that kind of come to you because there's something very organic about first draft. And that is beautiful and important. But the second draft is really, for me, when a book becomes the book that probably resembles something like what you're going to read, because the first draft is for raw material, and like you can't shape something out of nothing. So you've got to get the words down. And I know how hard it is. Like, finishing a novel is a massive achievement. Like, I think continuing and having the self-belief to keep going for 100,000 words and then letting the story carry you there, like I it's not to say that it's easy, but it's such an important step, isn't it?
Yeah, and it also, I think it takes the pressure off of that first draft, because
Yes.
the first draft should really be playtime. It should be, let me try this, let me try that, because the further along you go with each decision you make, you are cutting off options for yourself in terms of storytelling.
Yeah.
Whereas that first draft, it could be anything, you could go anywhere. And it really is a delight to play with the story that way, as opposed to putting so much pressure on yourself.
Yeah, and I think you can do some of your best work by giving yourself that mentality as well. I certainly find that saying to myself, like, even writing something and thinking, oh my God, I would never let anyone read that. Or, I know that's clumsy, or that's tonally, like, I'm trying to be too literary, or doing things where I push myself, like that's cringy, or, I do that in a first draft because no one's watching. No one's watching in the
Yeah.
first draft, and that's like, it's like dancing. It's like dancing in your room, and that is how it should feel, I think. And that's the delight of the first draft. It's actually my favorite part. And then reality hits, and you think, okay, so now people are watching me do this dance in my bedroom. So like, am I brave enough? Am I, and is this actually good? But if you've pushed yourself out of your comfort zone in that first draft, then you can, rein yourself back in or do what you need to do. But you've already gone a little bit further than you maybe would if you were kind of thinking about it too much.
Yeah, completely. So in terms of having almost dual timeline narratives or multiple timeline narratives, I always say that you're going to have a present day timeline, and then you're going to have the past. And you have to be so careful when you go back to the past, because the past cannot drag the reader back. When you put the past in the story, it needs to further the plot of the modern day story. Like, it needs to be that you planted curiosity seeds in the modern day, the reader's super curious about them, and so when you go back to the past, they actually are happy about it because they're getting payoffs for the seeds that you planted originally. But it really is a balancing act to make sure that you get that balance right. So is that something, again, that you play around with, or is it
Yeah.
because you've written so many books, you kind of feel that instinctively?
Oh, I think a lot of it is in instinct, and actually has always been, possibly was more so at the beginning. I probably think about these things harder now in some ways than I used to. But I totally agree with you. It's the challenge with a flashback or a back timeline, or really anything where you're asking a reader to pause the story they're currently embroiled in to do something else or be somewhere else or with someone else, is making it worth their while. Like, you just need to feel like the ideal is that they're kind of delighted to be wherever they are, not like it's another that chapter. And because I mostly write multiple points of view in my books, I am quite used to the challenge of hopping. And for me, often that hop can actually be very good for the energy of the novel, because you don't stay in one head too long. You're like boing boing boing. I'm hoping that makes some sense. It wasn't just some weird
No, it
sound.
does, because it helps with the tension and the pacing, right? Because you've
Totally.
gotten to a point in the present day story and it's like dun dun dun, and then you're like, but wait, this is how we
Mm.
got there. And then the reader's like, oh my God, really want to see how we got there. Because in the beginning, and this is something as well that emerging writers need to guard against, is they tell too much in the beginning. Whereas
I did this too. Yes.
yes, withholding as much as you can for as long as you can to keep the reader turning pages.
Yes, and also just telling less in general. Like, I think it's very telling that the first draft, the first manuscript of my debut, The Flat Share, which was the book that got me book, my first book deal, that went out to agents, and only one agent was interested in reading beyond the first three chapters. And then when it went out to publishers, it went in a preempt, and all around the world, people were I mean, it was absolutely the wildest and most amazing time of my life. But the difference, what had happened between those two things, was that the first three chapters had stopped. Like, the first three chapters when I sent it to agents were, here's loads of sort of everybody's day, here are who these people are. And what I have since learned, and what I worked on it with my agent before it went out on submission, what we took out a huge amount of content from the first like 6 chapters. And I am now such a fan of like, put people right in it. Don't really tell them anything. They don't need to be told anything. They're right there with you. Like, just let them learn who the people are by seeing them dealing with whatever it is you've thrown them right into at the start of the book.
Yeah, and it's starting immediately with the inciting incident as
Mm.
opposed to build up before the inciting incident. And these days, people's attention spans are really not great. So now
So
more than ever,
true.
you need to grab the reader. Whereas before, I think writers had the luxury of being, this is the usual day, la la la, birds chirping, and then
Yeah,
this happens. Now we
it's
just
reading
like
this
have to
novel,
get to it
or
faster.
doing some embroidery on a sofa, or whatever it is that people used to do back when novels were the only entertainment.
Yeah. Can we speak a bit about the world building? Because again, people think world building just pertains to fantasy novels. I mean, this was such a lovely setting, so quaint. It felt so real. The supporting characters, I mean, each of them could have been the main character in their own novel because you just love everybody so much. So can you speak a bit about building that kind of world?
Yes. Now, that was really important to me with this book in particular. Swept Away, which is the novel I wrote before The Name Game, is about two strangers who end up lost at sea together after a one night stand on a houseboat that is swept out to the ocean. So it is two people in one set with open sea all around them. And it was an amazing challenge to write. And I'm so proud of that book. But my goodness, when I finished it, I was like, give me some space and people. I was longing to write, a wonderful motley cast of characters again. So that is definitely what you get in The Name Game. And yeah, I think also Swept Away taught me so much about setting, because I was forced to use everything I had on that houseboat and the sea, like using, they had an unchanging scenery in some senses, but of course the sea and the sky are ever changing. But they was just really not, I didn't have the opportunity to have another character walk in to provide variety, or there was so much limitation that I looked a lot more for what I could do. And I think it showed me like how much setting can bring like to a novel in a way that I possibly hadn't explored as much before. So bringing the Isle of Orma, which is my fictional island that I got to invent, which was just, I mean, getting to invent a whole island after being in one tiny boat. I was like having so much fun, kind of being like, and then there could be this here, and creating my own world. It was really about making sure that I was coming back all the time to vibe, really, because I think actually with setting, that is more important than the stuff that's there. It's like, how does it evoke the feeling that you want people to feel in this place? Not really what it looks like. And for me, the island needed to be kind of earthy and stripped back. And, I quite consciously kind of don't have much tech. Like the island has no cars or streetlights, but also, I mean, like day to day, they're not posting on Instagram. They're not living the kind of life that we actually all are, where we're constantly sort of Googling stuff. And I wanted to use that to kind of create, that's part of the setting really, is the disconnectedness of it, but for it to kind of always have warmth and a sense of home and belonging. So I would always come back to vibe. And then it would be like, when you're naming the pub, how are you bringing the vibe? when you're describing this beach, like, how does it come back to that sense that you want the person to have when they feel like they're standing there? So yeah, I so enjoyed exploring setting with this one.
And setting really helps a lot with sort of character development and character arc, because when you're speaking about a book that's on a houseboat, that's a very claustrophobic sort of feel. Two people hugely claustrophobic, whereas with this book, you're giving your characters space and room to breathe, because they both arrive kind of damaged, and they need to like sort of exhale and find themselves, and that allows them to find each other. So setting is more than just backdrop. It really helps in terms of character development as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what they needed was sort of fresh air, and that's kind of what I wanted the setting to be. And actually, in Swept Away, what they needed was to not be able to get away from each other. They need, and so you're right, like you can use that setting to really, you can lean on it in the same way that you might tweak your characters to sort of, how can this bring more to my plot?
Yeah, it made me think of the Chicks. They used to be the Dixie Chicks. There's the lyric, she needed wide open spaces, room to make big mistakes. So yeah.
Beautiful.
Love this so much, Beth. So I'm holding it up again. We are going to link to it on our bookshop.org affiliate page. If you buy the book there, you support an independent bookstore and the podcast at the same time. Get this book to learn so much about the craft of writing, but also to just really enjoy it and gasp when you get to the twists. Like, be in touch with me and tell me when you get to them. Thank you so much, Beth.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been so great to chat.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's author interview. Our guest today is the best-selling author of 3 novels, The Hole in the Middle, Just Like Family, and Better Luck Next Time. She is also the co-author with Elizabeth Renzetti of the Quill & Packet mystery series. When not writing, she maintains an active psychotherapy practice, working with individuals and couples. She has a particular interest in personal reinvention and life transitions. She has had prior careers in law, university administration, and major gift fundraising. She lives in Toronto with her family. It's my pleasure to welcome back Kate Hilton. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Bianca. It's always so nice to see you.
It's always so lovely to see you. And for those of you who are not watching on YouTube, you have to go watch, because Kate's glasses are just incredible, as is her, I think it's a dress. It's just gorgeous. So for those of you who are missing out on the visuals, go and take a look. Okay. As well, I am holding up the book cover, City of the Muse. And this is an ARC, so an advanced reader copy. It is exquisite. So you know that the actual book itself is going to be stunning. Okay, Kate, will you please read us that flap copy for us?
I would love to. All right, here we go. Egypt, 1903. When renowned papyrologist Helen Gardner arrives at an excavation site in the ancient city of Calliopolis, she learns that she has been given the job because her predecessor has disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Only one of the women on the dig, Helen, tasked with restoring and cataloging the thousands of papyrus fragments recovered at the site, soon discovers that there's more to Calliopolis than meets the eye. The archaeologists on the dig, mostly men, all have not only their towering egos, but their own agendas, including secrets they might kill to protect. Toronto, 2019. Archivist Maddie Sloan is at a dead end. She feels like her academic career has stalled, and she's still healing from her recent breakup with her former partner, Ben. To make matters worse, Ben still works with Maddie's father, a famous archaeologist, and with whom Maddie has had a major falling out. It feels like her father has chosen Ben over her. When famous TV archaeologist Pete Pahar arrives at the Toronto Archaeological Museum to verify the provenance of objects from their Egyptian collection believed to be from Calliopolis, Maddie jumps at the opportunity. After all, she has her own ties to the cursed city of Calliopolis through her grandmother, Iris, who worked at the site. As Maddie and Peter begin digging into objects and circumstances surrounding the excavation, they learn that two papyrologists seem to have abruptly disappeared from the dig without an explanation. Suddenly, the search for provenance becomes a quest to uncover a history shrouded in secrets and lies, and a murder that has been covered up for more than a century.
Done. Okay, so from there, wow, Kate, so this book is so different from your others. And so I need to know how the idea began. Concept first, like, ooh, this is a cool concept, or did a character come to you and you were like, okay, character first, then concept. Take us through it.
Right. Well, I should maybe begin by saying that I have a lifelong, completely nerdy interest in archaeology. Like in grade 6, when you have to do, maybe it was the same in South Africa, maybe not, but in Canada in grade 6, in my era, you had to do a public speech in grade 6. And it was grade 6, they're 12, right? So it's like my dog Sammy, like what I like about koalas, right? Mine was on death and burial in ancient Egypt. So this is a long-standing interest, and probably also related to the fact that the King Tut exhibit had a huge international tour in the late 70s or early 80s when I was knee high, and I went to see that at the ROM in Toronto, and it was like brain exploding stuff. So that interest stayed with me always, and so I've continued to when I travel, I like to go see archaeological sites and so on. So that's, by way of background, that's a long-standing special interest, you might say. And I'm a neurodivergent person, so we take our special interests pretty seriously. And so for this particular book, I subscribe to National Geographic, and I'm always getting little tidbits about weird archaeological facts that I kind of squirrel away. For this book, it was a number of years ago, a couple of different news stories sort of collided in around the same time in my brain. And one had to do with a scandal at a museum at Oxford, where the collection of papyrus fragments collected at a site called Oxyrhynchus in the late 1800s are kept. They're stored there. They've been stored there since 1896. And they collected so many fragments at Oxyrhynchus that they've still only, like to this day, present day, have only translated a tiny, tiny fraction of them. Like 2%. I mean, like a really tiny fraction. And there was a huge scandal, which, you can look up, involving the curator of this collection and the allegation that he had perhaps taken some of these fragments and tried to sell them to the Big Bad Sackler family, who were building a museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. So it was a big scandal because some of these fragments are biblical, right? So that's why the Bible people wanted them. So that was one. There aren't, you can imagine, not a huge number of scandals in the field of papyrology or even Egyptology really anymore. But so this was like really big news in Egyptology. So I was pretty interested in that. It was like a dark academia scandal, an Egyptology scandal, like a classical literature scandal, like all wrapped into one. So it really like tickled my brain.
It's giving dark academia. I'm loving it.
Yeah. And there was at the same time another story about this like grad student, who those of us who were grad students or know people who are grad students know that, you spend a lot of your life like just trying to find something that's obscure enough that no one's written about it, and interesting enough that it might actually have some legs as an area of academic study. This is like a very hard needle to thread. And there was a graduate student somewhere in Italy who stumbled across a letter that Galileo had written, and it had been misfiled in the archives, right? It was like just in the wrong place. And he stumbled across it, and like, don't ask me what it said or why it was important, but it like completely changed how people understood the story that everyone knows about Galileo, that he sort of fell on his sword and, confessed to having misled the Pope or whomever about his findings, and then sort of off to the side said, but yet it moves. And anyway, so the story was that there was something about this letter that actually contradicted the known narrative about Galileo. And originally I thought I would do like an kind of an archive story, because that had been so interesting to me. And the finished book isn't really about archives, but I do have a character who is like an archivist who is really struggling to find her way in academia and trying to find it, mired in that moment of like, what have I done with 10 years of my life and nothing to show for it? And I'm now this lowly little bean counter in the basement of a museum. And then she finds something that really changes her world. So those two weird little National Geographic news stories were the impetus for the book.
I love it. But again, even more so because I will have these ideas, and I have idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, and I think they're all different books. They are things that I will have to, look at completely separately. And then when that aha moment comes, when you realize they are actually the same book.
Oh, it's best. Isn't that the best?
Right. It's just like fireworks going off and you're like, oh my God, the whole time I thought these were separate stories. They are not. So, I mean, firstly, okay, I wanted to ask you how long this took to write, because I can imagine this took a long time. And I think, were you working on different projects while you were working on this? Take us through that.
So I was probably working on this book for about 6 years, but always between other projects. So I think I started working on it when my third novel, Better Luck Next Time, was in edits. I started doing the research for it. That was probably around the time that I found these stories. And then I started reading all kinds of academic articles about, what people found on those digs, and learning about what papyrus studies was and what was the importance of these particular kind of finds in the history of Egyptology. And then I got really interested in women's roles in the field of archaeology, which maybe we should talk about later, but that's a super interesting field in and of itself. And then, and then that book came back and I promoted it. And then I was working on this book. I'd started writing this book when the pandemic hit. And because this book is a departure for me, but also so research heavy, and I was really, working in isolation through the pandemic, I kind of got a little stuck on it. And then the story goes that Liz Renzetti and I were, wandering around in the snow in Toronto at a particularly low point in the pandemic, and both of us working on projects that were kind of like a little bit stuck in the shallows, and said, like, what if we just had some fun writing something different for a while? And then the Quillenpecca mystery series came. So then we wrote 2 more books in that series while I was still writing this book. So this poor book just kept getting shunted aside, but I was always happy to go back to it. And I was very happy when the time came that I had a really nice runway to work on it, which sort of happened in the last couple of years.
That's incredible. So I have tried to cheat on books with other books, and it just, I don't know. I've been trying recently, especially, and I just can't. So I'm so fascinated when people can do that. And I'm fascinated by writing collaborations like you and Liz have. I've told you guys both, I think it's absolutely incredible. But that, again, for our listeners, this is so important, because sometimes a story needs room to breathe. Sometimes
Totally.
It isn't the story for right now, but that doesn't mean, burn it or reject it for all eternity. Sometimes it just means work on something else and come back, and then things might fall into place for it.
I mean, I really think of myself as quite a monogamist when it comes to my projects, but I think that's just a story I tell myself. Like, looking back, I've played around a lot. And it's because books have a momentum arc to them, and they're different for every book. And somewhere for me in the middle, I get like overcome with a sense that I do not have what it takes to write this book. Like, it's not good enough to realize this book, or I'm too exhausted to realize this book. And I do need to toggle sometimes to just get a different injection of fuel. And sometimes, like, the life of publishing lets you do that, just because books are coming out and you take a break and you do promotion and you're at different life stages with projects. You're editing one, you're drafting another. But I like that better. Like, it's not ideal to be really deep into first drafts at the same time. I would say to your readers, to your listeners, there was a point in time where I completely had to shelve a book. And I remember saying to Liz, I've now discovered something about myself as a writer. I cannot write two first drafts at the same time. Neither of them is getting enough of me. So I wouldn't set out to do that again, I have to say. Yeah. Personally.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so in terms of the dual timeline, dual POV narrative, I'm assuming that from when the idea fell into place, that is how it was always going to be, or was it a case of you started with one and then realized you needed the other one?
I always knew it would be a dual timeline. I like dual timeline mysteries a lot. And I think I was thinking about people like Kate Morton, who I think does such a good job with that. I love a cold case, right? So my own tastes in mysteries, like if you said to me, it's a cold case, it has either an archaeological or artistic or literary thing going on in the past, and there's some object or piece of writing, or like Possession is one of my favorite books. A.S. Byatt's Possession, that's an older book now, but when I was an English literature major, I thought that book was like the absolute peak of perfection. And so I have an attachment to those types of stories, and I wanted to write one of my own. I mean, I think it's always a good rule of thumb to write books you want to read. And so this book, it tickled me in a bunch of my different interests, and dual timeline was one of the components I wanted to play with.
And those of you who do it so well make it look easy. But here's the thing with a dual timeline narrative, especially when the, say, present day one has got to do with figuring out what happened in the past, is it really is a balancing act. So when you go from the present day back to the past narrative has actually got to be feeding the present day narrative, right? There's got to be a golden thread between both narratives, one, to explain why they're on two different books entirely, and two, so that when the reader goes from the present to the past, they don't feel like, oh, we're going back to the past again, because they are actually going there to get answers to questions that you have planted in the present narrative.
Exactly. And really I think that it is about keeping the momentum going, because it's very easy to lose that energy when you're switching timelines. So you have to continue the thread of suspense, in particular, that you feel like you're, as a reader, continuing on your hunt for answers as you jump through time, and that in a satisfactory kind of a way, your own investigation into the book, whether it's a mystery or not. I mean, every book is a mystery in a sense. Why are we here? Why are we reading this story? What are we trying to learn about this character? Like, what will happen? And so when we're jumping through timelines, we have to feel like we're moving forward in our understanding of whatever that essential question that we're trying to answer is.
So what I just remembered what I was going to say earlier. You were saying that you get to a point in a project where you're like, can I do this? Can I do justice to this? Can I carry on? And I get to that point as well. But my favorite part, because the part when I know that I'm actually going to finish this book, is the part when I'm terrified I'm going to die before I finish the book. It's like, oh my
Yes,
God, I'm
you're
going to get
not the
hit by
only
a bus or
person.
something's going to happen before I finish this book. And that's when I know I've built up enough momentum to keep going. I don't know if you reached that point after the I can't do this.
I'm so happy I'm not the only person who experiences that. It's like deep writer psychosis, right? It's like, I must see this through. I'll crawl across the desert on my
I don't
hands
take a
and
lot
knees.
of notes while I'm actually writing, but when I get to that point, I start making notes for the author who has to step in and finish my book after I've
I love
done.
that so much. Writers are so crazy in their own distinctive ways. I feel seen. Thank you, Bianca.
Here we go. Okay, so now differentiating our characters in our dual timeline narratives, because what you write so well is like strong woman, the kind of woman you don't expect to find at a particular point in time. I mean, if we look at Helen for her time, so, going against everything what everyone wants for her. And then we come to Maddie, who, okay, it's 2019 and she's feeling a little bit lost. She's got more to prove. But again, it's so important in those two different narratives to completely separate them in a way so that the reader could pick up the page and not even see the headline and where we are to be able to know which character they're with. What's your advice there?
Well, a couple of things. So the first is, if you're writing historicals, right, and you want to write strong female characters, I mean, obviously strong women have existed throughout history and found a way to sort of buck against the strictures of their particular circumstances. But there are always people you can read about. So I was very interested to read about specific and real life women who had been part of the very early days of archaeology, because archaeology was a really new discipline. And so the women who were there in that discipline were going to university. They were getting kind of the first university degrees issued to women. Women mostly were not given degrees. They could go to university, but they wouldn't be given degrees at the end of it. And they were given degrees in archaeology because it was this new science, and they hadn't really figured out that there was kind of anything in it to exclude women from yet, right? It had no it was like no, there was no franchise to protect particularly, so women were there. And you can imagine the kind of women in that era who wanted to go into dusty, dirty, dangerous places and do this kind of work that was both extremely intellectual but also extremely menial, because everyone was literally carrying baskets of dirt out, and no one, they were inventing a whole discipline, right? So you just kind of did it all. These were very unusual women, and there are lots of wonderful books. Kathleen Shepard, who's an American professor, does a lot of work on these women, and she's written a wonderful book called Women in the Valley of the Kings. Yeah, incredible book, full of stories about these people. So my first piece of advice for your listeners is do your research, right? Because the women exist, at any point in history, who are just doing something a little bit different. And I always liked to start kind of grounding in reality, because the way independence and free thinking and spirit kind of shows up, it is historically specific, right? Things that feel like radical acts of individuality in 1890 look really different than radical acts of individuality in 2026. And so you really need to, I think, situate yourself in those time periods so that you're not writing someone who's completely ahistorical. But yeah, for character, I mean, I don't know, just to introduce a whole other thread, I'm a psychotherapist, so I've spent my whole life being very interested in what makes up a character. That is to say, how does a person think about themselves? What stories do they have about themselves and their relationships? What stories do they have about themselves and their strengths? What dreams do they have for themselves? Do they see themselves as a collection of roles? Do they see themselves as a collection of wishes, interests, priorities, relationships? What are they proud of? about themselves. What kinds of moments in their lives do they feel define them as a person? And that, so in a sense, characters are like regular people, right? We all have those. We could all tell a story about ourselves and what makes us us. And past or present, you want to be able to do that with your characters. And so I always feel like there are as many different kinds of strong female characters as there are different kinds of weak female characters. It's not a particular, the strong woman character isn't a particular kind of Barbie that you trot out, and that's your strong woman Barbie, right? They're strong in different ways in different circumstances, and everybody has things about them that make them vulnerable.
Yeah. And I mean, you chose to write Helen in the past in the first person, and then Maddie sort of present day in the third person. Again, is that like, how do you decide which character should be first, which should be third? Do you play around with that until the voice feels right to you? Because I talk on the podcast all the time about circling the building of the work. And at the beginning, there are so many options available to us. But writers like yourself, I know that you're very intentional with your choices. So can you take us through that?
Yeah, point of view. I've played with point of view in each of the books I've done. I've played with it a little bit. And so I don't have one default point of view that I always go back to. And it is a question. I love the way that you phrase that, of circling the building and figuring out what is the right thing for this book and for this character. I am quite an auditory writer. That is to say, I hear voices. I can hear, there's a sense in which I can hear my characters' voices much more than I can see them, for example. And I write with Liz, who's very visual as a writer. And I'm not. Like, I can't tell you exactly what people look like. And if you read closely, you'll notice I don't have a lot of physical descriptions because it feels a little forced to me. What I can do is really hear them. I can hear them talking. I can hear their dialogue. And Helen was always in the first person for me. I could just really hear her. And I liked the contrast of doing a different point of view between the two parts of the book. And I feel like the first person in the past was great because you're really being dropped into a foreign place, right? It's a long time ago. It's a different part of the world, but it's also a very distinctive setting, like an archaeological dig site at that particular point in time. Like, none of us have been there, and none of us really know very much about it because it's not even a part of Egyptology. Like, so there's archaeology, and in that there's the House of Egyptology, and deep buried in that is this tiny little hut of papyrology, and most people know nothing about it, right? So putting it in the first person just makes it more immediate. Like, it's more startling. It's like you feel it there, and I think you don't have to work as hard to try to picture it. You're just there. In the present, the third person just let me do a wider lens. I felt like I wanted you to be really literally in the dirt with Helen. With Maddie, I wanted you to be able to kind of see a way broader lens because I'm also talking about a whole lot of political and cultural themes about artifacts and institutions and how they operate. And I just wanted to have a little bit of a wider lens, I think, in the present day. And third person, you give up something in immediacy to get a broader view of the landscape.
Yeah, I love that. And for our listeners, so important because how Kate just spoke about it just speaks to the, you choosing something on purpose to serve a purpose as opposed to just being like, kind of like third person past, Like, remember, in past tense, if somebody is relating something in past tense, they can give foreshadowing, for example, that you can't have in the present tense, but you have immediacy in the present tense. So always weigh those pros and cons. We're pretty much at the end of our time, but something that I also wanted to ask you, Kate, was coming up with Calliopolis. It's not a real place, but it's based on real places. Did you have, I know you said you're not really a visual person. Did you create maps of the place to keep everything in your mind, drawings or something?
I did. I hand drew a map that I was using and I kept changing it around because I did want to be kind of realistic about it. It's this town is imaginary, but it's roughly in the location of a town that exists now that wasn't especially itself famous as a dig site, but has in its vicinity many, many famous sites, which were all kind of a feature of a geographical shift in irrigation. If
Right.
stay with me, in Egypt. So there were off the Niles, there was a period of time where a whole lot of canals got built to irrigate the desert, right? And then, politics shifted, pharaonic power kind of disappeared. There was a lot of political shifting around. The canals silted in. And so there are all kinds of towns dotted through an area called the Fayum Desert and then a little outside of it that became kind of ghost towns, right? Because they're like, like the towns like Ephesus in Turkey and Rye in England, where the ocean receded and these towns, which had been really incredible and important ports, got, orphaned, right? And so that happened all over this part of Egypt. And it left these little time capsules of these places that had been extremely important port towns and had, very active literary cultures, for example, which is important for papyrus, because they were up kind of at the top of culture where, you've taken care of shelter and food and housing, and now you're into the arts production and, having interesting food and like having delegations of authority and all kinds of government and so on, right? Which happens as a society becomes more powerful and sophisticated. And then they just like got cut off at the knees because these canals silted up. So that's what makes them interesting from a papyrus point of view. And so I imagined a town like this that had these traits, that had been on a canal, and there are many of them like it, and many of them have produced really incredible artifacts. And the artifacts that get found in this book are artifacts that have been found at some of these sites.
Okay, very last question. With the research, I find as a writer that research becomes a procrastination tool for me because the more I find out, the more I want to find out, and eventually it goes way off. So how do you know with this kind of book? Because it's like the tip of the iceberg. You've got to know so much, but you can't show your reader everything you know. Otherwise, it's going to feel like a textbook. So how do you get that balance of the tip of the iceberg and know how to include just enough for specificity, but not so much that it's too much?
This is not going to be that helpful for your readers. It's a feeling. It's a feeling about like internally, I'm now avoiding the writing, right?
Yes.
I'm there's a point at which you know that you know enough to write, right? But you're avoiding the writing because the writing is hard and the research is fun. So it's like that moment of catching yourself in, I could read one more book about this thing I've already read a few books about, or I could get down to the business of writing, knowing that if I hit a point where I feel like I need to know more about one specific thing, I'm pretty sure I can go stop, take a day and find the resource, right? So some of that is just the discipline of curbing your own special interest and your own avoidance about doing the hard stuff. But some of it is like you don't even necessarily know what you need to know until you get into the book. You have a sense of what the big themes are, and you know enough about who this character is and what they're doing to get started on a first draft or an outline, right? And there are things, even though I'm a planner and I accept that as a planner, there is pantsing that has to happen along the way. And if you're a pantser, there's some planning that has to happen along the way. We know this. So I know that even though I'm a planner, my plan will have to change because as I'm writing, there'll be stuff that isn't working or stuff that I think I need to take this in a slightly different direction to pull in the other timeline, right? Especially with the dual timeline, when you're trying to match them up, you're going to find that what you thought was going to work doesn't. And then there are moments where you have to develop something different so that it's more exciting. There's something better to find in the present or whatever the problem is. But the dual timeline problem definitely creates quite a few moments along the way where you have to stop and rethink.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of our time. I have a ton more questions, but luckily I'll be getting to interview Kate again, so I will hopefully get through all of those. I'm holding up the cover again, City of the Muse. Please, we'll link to it on our bookshop.org affiliate page. If you buy it there, you support an independent bookstore and the podcast at the same time, and you support Kate. Kate, we wish you so much luck with this book.
Thank you. I'll see you at the launch.
Yay!
Yay!
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you'll join us for next week's show. In the meantime, keep at it. Remember, it just takes one yes.